China's leader rarely, if ever, criticises the US directly. But at the latest Communist Party Congress, President Xi Jinping said this: Western countries led by the United States have implemented all-round containment, encirclement and suppression of China. Closed meeting of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. And his comments were first reported by the state news agency Xinhua. At a later news conference, the foreign minister, Qin Gang, went further, saying the US should change its policies or risk conflict with China.
美国的对华认知
If the United States does not hit the brake but continues to speed on the wrong path, no amount of guardrails can prevent derailing, and there'll be conflict and confrontation. Who will bear the catastrophic consequences? Such competition is a reckless gamble, with the stakes being the fundamental interest of the two peoples and even the future of humanity. Naturally, China is firmly opposed to all this.
In recent years, China's technological ambitions have been constrained by a series of restrictions from the US and others. So what to make of those comments from the Chinese president? I asked our Asia-Pacific editor Celia Hatton for her reaction.
Frankly, shock to hear those words from Xi Jinping, from China's really powerful leader. You know, I've been covering China for 20 years, and I had to double check that those words were attributed to Mr. Xi, because he never says things like this. In fact, most China watchers think this is the first time he's ever directly called out the United States using such language. It certainly directs attention towards the United States, places a lot of blame at the United States, right as China's in the middle of its all-important parliamentary two sessions, they're called. What I think is also interesting, though, is that he didn't make these comments directly in the parliamentary building, in the Great Hall of the People, not to all of the 3,000 parliamentary delegates. Instead, he made them behind closed doors. He actually made them on Monday, but they weren't reported by state media until today. So, yes, they're very direct comments, but they're still made behind closed doors. So, in a way, we're hearing what Xi Jinping thinks privately, even though these words are attributed to him.
What does he want to happen, and what's likely to happen as a result of these comments?
Xi Jinping certainly sets the tone for what other Chinese leaders are going to say. So he made these comments on Monday, and then we heard them repeated, similar comments from Qin Gang, from the foreign minister. And so really this allows other people below Xi Jinping to kind of then also attack the United States in a more direct manner. So that's quite important. I think also it shows that China is really unlikely to back down publicly in a lot of further confrontations with the United States, because Xi Jinping has basically told them they can't. However, it's possible that Beijing is thinking about following some U.S. not directives, but falling in line. So perhaps they are going to refrain from giving weapons to Russia. Perhaps they are going to hold off on a possible invasion of Taiwan. But they don't want to make it seem as if they're following U.S. orders directly. So this is a way of holding their heads high, criticizing the U.S., but actually doing some things that Washington wants right now.
And might it make also China look more inward in terms of supplying those key things that they need for their technological sector?
Yeah, in fact, they've also just announced this morning in some policies that haven't been totally fleshed out yet, but this idea that they're going to start really pushing their own homegrown tech. They really have to do this because U.S. sanctions on Chinese-made technology are really starting to ramp up. And so Beijing really has no choice. If they really want to get their economy going again, it's at a 30-year low at the moment. If they really want to start doing that, they're going to have to start relying on themselves a bit more.
Celia Hatton. Well, China's relations with the West have been touched upon by the UN Human Rights Chief at a major speech in Geneva. Volker Turk said he'd opened up channels with China to follow up on various issues, including the treatment of China's Muslim minority Uyghurs, which was highlighted in a special UN report on Xinjiang last year. I heard more from our Geneva correspondent Imogen Folks.
What Volker Turk said was that he had made recommendations to China about the contents of that report. Let's not forget it contained credible evidence of possible crimes against humanity, that report. Now, many human rights activists would have liked to see that report debated right here in Geneva, but member states said, no, we're going to put it on the back burner for now. So Volker Turk said clearly, well, I haven't forgotten it. I've made recommendations. Those recommendations require, and that's the operative word, an answer. But I think among diplomats, it reflects what Celia Hatton was just saying there now. They don't think it's the moment to go full confrontation with China right now. They don't want to push China closer to Russia and getting involved in that war. In fact, one very, very senior UN official said to me last week, off the records, I can't tell you who it was, but very senior, let's not forget it is Beijing that has told Moscow nuclear weapons are a red line for us. You do that, we're out of here. You can forget us. And I think that's very in the, the top of the agenda a little bit in the minds of Western diplomats right now.
Our Geneva correspondent Imogen Folks. Now, have you heard of methane bombs? Well, according to The Guardian newspaper, they pose a huge threat to the climate, with the potential to release the equivalent of 30 years of US greenhouse gas emissions. The newspaper revealed details of more than 1,000 super emitter sites pumping methane gas into the atmosphere, the worst of which spewed out pollution equivalent to 67 million cars. I spoke to our environment correspondent, Matt McGrath.
Methane is one of the most powerful warming gases in wide usage around the world. Methane has been growing for the last 15 years or so, and it's about 80 times more warming than carbon dioxide. It doesn't last as long, but it does in that period of 10 years when it's active in the atmosphere cause a lot of problems. And it comes from numerous different sources, from the oil and gas industry, from agriculture, from cows, and also from refuse sites. So there are a number of different problems with it. What this report suggests is that last year, in 2022, some sites, about 1,000 of them, were producing huge amounts of methane going up into the atmosphere. One of the sites in Turkmenistan was producing about 427 tons per hour at peak rate. So it's a very bad picture, particularly in countries like the US, Russia and Turkmenistan, which have the most facilities that are leaking.
And what are these methane bombs that the report refers to?
Yeah, the report talks about these methane bombs as locations, most of them oil and gas facilities, where if you add up all the methane that's going to come out of them, it'll be over 1 billion tons over the lifetime of these oil and gas facilities. Now, half of them or so are in operation. The rest of them aren't yet in operation. And that's the big worry, that they would, if all developed under current plans, completely blow the budget to keeping global temperatures under 1.5 degrees Celsius, which all the countries in the world have essentially committed to do.
And is this a new problem, or are we just becoming more aware of it?
It's a problem that's been going on a long time. It's gotten worse since about 2007. And the real worry about methane is that, methane is produced by the activity of bacteria. And the warmer the world gets through our actions, essentially, the more bacteria produce more methane in wetlands, in refuse sites, amongst cattle and so on. I suppose the good news in all this, if you wanted to look for a silver lining, is that it is readily dealt with, because countries around the world have signed up to remove methane as much as possible over the next 10 years. So while it has an enormous warming potential and is extremely dangerous, people are aware of it and taking action. And as we know, over the last year, the price of gas, of which methane is a form, has gone through the roof, and is a big financial incentive for countries to cut their emissions of methane in the near term.
Way back when the Soviet Union was disintegrating, the whole status of Ukraine in the post-Soviet bloc was a big issue, and Russia, wanted to have as close a possible relationship with it, and they did with President Yankovic. He was very much a pro-Russian leader. That was the moment when Russia and Ukraine were basically on the same page, and Yankovic didn't want to have anything to do with the European Union, and that suited Putin down to the ground, and he certainly didn't want anything to do with NATO. But then he was overthrown in one of the Velvet Revolutions, and then recent political leaders in Ukraine have wanted to swing westwards to have a membership of the European Union, and in Zelensky's case, to actually be a member of NATO. And that's what alarmed Russia a lot. And as you know, there was a lot of kind of controversy about NATO expansion in that post-Soviet era.
Can you go back to that a bit and talk about that?
Yes. Well, at the end of the Cold War, there were lots of conversations between Gorbachev and Reagan and others about how the West would not try and expropriate former Russian allies and Warsaw Pact members, and the way in which they indicated they wouldn't do, they would abide by that, was by saying that they would not seek membership of former Soviet satellites into NATO.
There's a lot of controversy on that question, isn't there? I tried to find evidence that there had been a verbal promise, and I couldn't find that. I found a person, a diplomat who had been there, who said there wasn't a verbal.
Yeah, Bob Zolik. Yeah. He felt that there wasn't, but in a lot of certainly in the security discussions and so forth, there was a kind of a recognition that NATO expansion would generate anxiety in Russia.
Okay.
Whether it was formally agreed or not, I mean, I don't think that's the point. I mean, it was just that basically lots of the strategic commentators and others felt that getting erstwhile Warsaw Pact allies into NATO without offering something similar to Russia itself. Remember, right at the very beginning in the post-Soviet period, there was even a kind of a strong desire that the OSCE should be expanded a bit and that Russia should become a dialogue partner with NATO and, more importantly, a kind of a security partner with NATO. And that was that certainly has been documented, and that was basically undermined by the West.
What happened to Russia at that point, immediately after Gorbachev? Because it changed considerably, and in some ways, I suppose that people would recognize as favorable, but in other ways, very unfavorably.
Well, what happened was that
the example that happened maybe in New Zealand and Chile.
Yeah. Gorbachev was a very distinctive Russian leader. He definitely was very interested in glasnost and opening up to the West. He was very keen as well on dismantling sort of socialist economy and replacing it with a capitalist one. What I don't think he really recognized was that in his absence, Soviet leaders who succeeded him would become so kind of personally rapacious, sell off, lots of Soviet assets, former Soviet assets. Privatize them, sell them off, and create a huge oligarchy, which replaced the old Communist Party oligarchy. But at the same time, that oligarchy had little or no interest in developing sort of strong and cordial security relationships. It simply wanted to make conditions profitable for their own economic activity.
Putin was part of that, wasn't he?
Putin was definitely part of that. Yeah, and to add insult to injury there, I mean, Putin managed to kind of change the constitution so that he could be prime minister and then come back as president, and then succeeded in kind of basically installing himself in perpetuity, which meant that it was very difficult then for dissidents in Russia who wanted, good and cordial relationships with the West, or who wanted, something approximating a welfare state to replace the Russian system. Those people were all completely marginalized. Yeah, and then there'd been discussions in Minsk and so forth, which had been facilitated by Germany and France and others, about how to make sure that Ukrainian sovereignty was respected, and that's where a lot of the discussions around. Sorry, I'm backtracking a little bit, but when the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine still was providing storage facilities for Russian nuclear weapons, and there was a deal made there that if Ukraine gave up those nuclear weapons, returned to Russia, that there would be security guarantees for their sovereignty. And that was quite explicit, and that gave rise into the different Minsk agreements around, what Russia would or wouldn't accept in terms of its own relationships with Ukraine.
Well, tell us a little bit about that, because there was a fair size minority of Russians in eastern Ukraine, as I understand it. And,
yeah, no, that's one of
minority.
Yeah,
there's
that was one of the big challenges.
Wanted some kind of independence from Ukraine, or else
no, that was
Russia.
Yeah. And that this is one of the big challenges, because under the former Soviet Union, Russia, of course, sent a lot of Russians into the different satellite countries, and significant numbers of them remain. So the most significant number outside of the Donbass would be in Kaliningrad, in the Baltic states. And Russia's feeling is that wherever there are majorities of Russian speakers, then Russia has some rights to defend them and so forth. So if you take one of the former Russian satellites in Georgia, when that split up between Georgia and Abkhazia, there was a strong Russian majority in Abkhazia, and the Russians just quietly, as soon as they lost their Georgian citizenship and their passports were no longer Georgian and they couldn't get around, the Russian government simply started providing all Abkhazians with Russian passports and then basically annexed Abkhazia. And I think it was sort of hoping that it could do something similar to the Ukraine. Well, I mean, I think all of the pundits who have looked at this think that he made a major strategic mistake. He could have he could have really probably developed a kind of a very soft invasion when Yankovic was president and the pro-Russian leader. He chose not to do that then, but at that same time, they did have agreements about Russian protection of Russian speakers in the Donbass. I think he just got impatient. He could see that Zelensky was not going to be a compliant puppet. And I think they really did believe that they could have a blitzkrieg kind of invasion that would result in the rapid overthrow of Ukraine. So I think he made some major strategic blunders, and certainly didn't calculate that Ukraine would defend themselves to the extent to which they have. But his basic orientation is to restore Mother Russia to its kind of former imperial glory, which means significant intervention in Poland and Finland and the Baltic states and in all the Caucasus, and he would like to be able to have a Russian sphere of influence there, and that was certainly one of the major motivators. But I don't think there's any doubt at all that expansion of NATO proved to be a kind of a straw too far, really, for Putin. He felt that when it looked as though all of the former Soviet allies suddenly switched, then Russia itself began to feel rather isolated.
Ukraine itself, and why?
Well, the major motivation for annexing Crimea was that if Crimea was in a relationship with Ukraine, it placed in jeopardy the whole of the Russian Black Sea port for its military, for its navy. So there were strong strategic reasons to kind of annex Crimea. And again, there were large numbers of Russian speakers in Crimea, but at the same time, there were large numbers of Tatars. The former Cossacks had formed a very integral part of Russian military in the past. And the Tatars, though, I think would actually prefer to be with Ukraine than with Russia. Well, because they could see some reasons why it was within the Russian sphere of influence. They didn't want to provoke a confrontation. I think they also felt that the Ukrainian military and Zelensky at that stage weren't prepared for a fight. So I think they were willing to let it go. They did impose sanctions, and they expressed discontent at the annexation. And they were definitely worried, the West was definitely worried then about wider Russian intentions. But by and large, they felt that it was within the Russian sphere of influence because of the Black Sea port.
Some people, of course, will say that was a warning that you have to react strongly and militarily when something like this happens.
Yeah, that's right. The Hawks would say that would have been the moment for the West to have drawn a red line. The West didn't. I don't think it really wanted to buy a fight with Russia over Crimea. The supply lines and logistics of defending that, that part of Ukraine would have been very challenging, especially since there was already kind of a lot of Russian build-up of mercenaries and others in the Donbass.
I was looking at a map of Crimea itself, and there's a little isthmus that goes right into the Ukraine, but in other respects it's like an island. I was wondering if you were bargaining, you could say, we want this isthmus so we'll always have access to the Black Sea. I mean, Ukraine could say, but you could have the main part of Crimea, and then you also have access to the Black Sea and all the ports you need.
I think that would. I think that's got to be part of a kind of a negotiating plan. At the moment we're a long way from that, but I also think that it's not very helpful for Zelensky to say, well, there's no negotiations until absolutely every bit of Ukrainian territory is returned. I don't think that's going to happen. And so I think it's very important that Zelensky kind of has some sense about what he really wants to, what he would consider central to his sovereignty, security, and a stable border.
His tone has changed, hasn't it? He was always going to defend Ukraine very bravely himself. He put himself at risk. But he talked, I think, if I remember correctly, more about negotiation possibilities 6 months ago than now.
Yeah, and they had these February conversations around, which were apparently quite congenial, and about what Russia wanted and what Ukraine could tolerate, but they all ended. Apart from the high-level consultations about prisoner swaps, which have been going on in Turkey now for nearly the whole year.
Once Ukraine was invaded, did they actually have a realistic choice between anything between surrender or self-defense? I mean, it's...
well, they could have chosen to become a puppet regime of Russia, but they certainly had no desire to do that after the Velvet Revolution. So, and I think there was a kind of a strong sense that even with the high levels of corruption and so forth, there was a strong sense that they could become a kind of a former Russian democracy. So I don't think that surrender was an option. So self-defense was all that remained. And it shows you that between 2014, when Russia invaded and annexed Crimea, Ukraine had actually become quite well equipped militarily from America and NATO and so forth for realistic self-defense, which is why they chose self-defense.
Also, he got elected partially on anti-corruption, and he's done work on anti-corruption even recently, as I understand it. Yeah,
he's actually sacked some of his close ministers who were involved in corruption. Crimea still ranks, in the bottom 5% of the anti-corruption index, Transparency International's corruption index. So that's a major problem. And there's also a lot of anxiety around how much of the weaponry that's flowing in there is going completely to the Ukrainian army, or whether some of it's being siphoned off for more malign purposes. I mean, either for weapon sales on the black market or worse, kind of different kind of mercenary groups and so forth in Ukraine.
No matter what one thinks about the motives of provocation or lack of provocation of the invasion in Ukraine, it was extreme and by its nature inexcusable and evil, and an inexcusable and evil action. Acknowledging all this, could you talk about seeing the conflict in black and white terms with Putin as an evil man, madman comparable to Hitler?
Well, I don't think there's any doubt that anybody that's got a sort of even the vaguest of interest in the United Nations Charter has to see this invasion as a clear act of aggression and contrary to UN rules and regulations. So there's no doubt that it was, seen as absolutely inexcusable. An unacceptable action on the part of a bordering nation state, and an action that really challenged what has not been challenged for a very long time, which is the safety and security of agreed borders, and in Europe as well. So this is, so there's absolutely no doubt at all that Russia committed, a major international crime by invading Ukraine. I think that the Western response to that, at one level can be justified as, supporting the victim in the face of unacceptable illegal action. But I think that insofar as the West and others have been describing this as a kind of a just war and a war between good and evil, I think that's a challenge if you wanted ceasefire negotiations or if you want a negotiated settlement to the war. I mean, the one thing that nobody wants is a kind of a stalemate with Russians in the Donbass and Ukrainians on the other side sniping at each other, like as in North and South Korea. So I don't think it's helpful to demonize Putin in that way. I think it certainly doesn't create a good climate for negotiations.
Even in the heat of the Cold War, there were many diplomats and so on who didn't see Russia or even communism entirely evil. I've been reading the history of George Kennan, who was the main strategist of containment of the Soviet Union, but he saw the containment as economic and cultural mainly. You want to talk about him and what he had to say?
Yeah, Kennan was very interesting because he certainly, in recent times, was very distressed. Like archhawks like Kissinger saying that, you don't want to kind of keep prodding a wounded bear because they're just going to get crazier and crazier. So Kennan and a lot of other distinguished foreign policy commentators are saying that it's not a good idea to sort of see this conflict in Manichaean uneval terms. I had an example of this the other night. I went and attended the prayer meeting given by a Ukrainian Catholic bishop in St. Joseph's Cathedral here in Dunedin. And the liturgy, I expect the liturgy to be all about peace, but in the last 2 pages of the liturgy, it was basically calling on God to defend Ukraine against the evildoers on the other side, and wanting to make sure that God was able to smite them down and remove their shields so that they could be given the kind of treatment that God would accord to evil perpetrators. And I don't think that kind of position is really helpful. And so Kennan, I think we should listen to the wisdom of Kennan. He knew a lot about Russia and how to contain it.
He lived in Russia
and as you said, he was certainly very averse to making sure that it was military containment. He saw that as kind of wasteful and ultimately self-defeating.
Yep, but he was very anti-communist.
He certainly was very anti-communist.
And very anti